I always thought life would be simple after marriage. Raised in a modest, loving home, I carried my parents' values of kindness, humility, and strength with me after their tragic loss in my late teens. Ethan, my husband, captured my heart during our college years. He was charming, driven, and seemed like the perfect partner. At first, his family seemed warm and welcoming. His mother, Eleanor, greeted me with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, while his father, Gerald, was quiet, often casting disapproving glances at me. Still, I believed the best in them because I loved Ethan. After our wedding, we moved into the grand family estate. As Eleanor insisted, she assured me it would be temporary until we could afford our own place. At the time, I thought it was an act of generosity, but I didn't realize it was a gilded cage. The changes were subtle at first. Eleanor often compared me to other daughters-in-law from their social circle, successful, wealthy women. Olivia hosted a charity event for 300 people all by herself, she once mentioned, her voice dripping with faint admiration. Quite impressive, don't you think, Ethan? I smiled, masking the sting. That's impressive, I replied. She's a natural, Eleanor added, her gaze cutting into me. Not everyone has that kind of upbringing. Ethan didn't intervene. He didn't even seem to notice. It was easier for him to let these remarks slide than to confront them. Soon enough, Eleanor began treating me less like a daughter-in-law and more like hired help. She left me lists of tasks, ironing clothes, polishing silverware, preparing meals. I tried to please her, hoping to gain her approval, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One evening, after preparing an elaborate dinner, Eleanor tasted the soup and grimaced. "It's too salty," she declared, pushing the bowl away. "Do it again tomorrow, but follow the recipe." Ethan said nothing, not even meeting my eyes. With Ethan working long hours, I spent my days alone in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. I tried to fill the void with hobbies and socializing, but Eleanor discouraged me. "Your place is here," she insisted when I mentioned joining a local art class. "There's plenty for you to do at home." It became clear that Eleanor didn't view me as an equal partner to her son, but as an inconvenience, someone Ethan had foolishly married beneath their social standing. Despite this, I still hoped Ethan would notice how his family was treating me and put an end to it. The turning point came one evening during a family dinner when Gerald invited Mr. Hawkins, an influential business associate. As we prepared, Eleanor's instructions were relentless. "Make sure the linens are perfect," she snapped, "and don't embarrass us in front of Mr. Hawkins. He values class, and you're still learning." Her words stung, but I nodded and set the table with care. When Mr. Hawkins arrived, I was briefly introduced before being ushered to the kitchen. I overheard snippets of their conversation while serving appetizers. "She's very lucky to be part of this family," Gerald was saying. "Ethan is too kind, he could have married anyone, but he's too good-hearted." The message was clear, I was nothing more than a charity case. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my composure. The evening dragged on, and by the time it ended, I was left cleaning up alone. Ethan didn't offer any help. In the solitude of the dimly lit kitchen, I broke down, tears streaming as I scrubbed dishes, wondering how my life had taken this turn. Little did I know that night would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. After that dinner, I felt emotionally drained. My days blurred into one another, cooking, cleaning, and feeling invisible in a house that should have been my refuge. But something about that night stuck with me, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. A week later, Eleanor summoned me to the living room. She sat on the ornate couch with a cup of tea, while Gerald stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his usual disapproving expression on his face. "We're hosting Mr. Hawkins again," Eleanor announced. "This time, we need to make an excellent impression. Gerald's been working on a big deal with him, and we can't afford any mistakes." I swallowed hard. "Of course, what do you need from me?" "Everything must be perfect," she said coldly, "and this time, try not to look so plain. Presentation is key." I flushed with embarrassment but nodded as I walked away, crushed by their expectations. To them, I wasn't just a wife, I was a tool in their pursuit of social standing. On the night of the dinner, I worked tirelessly to ensure everything was flawless. By the time the guests arrived, I was exhausted, but Eleanor insisted I look presentable. When Mr. Hawkins arrived, his commanding presence seemed to fill the room. Tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding authority, he scanned the room until his gaze landed on me. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition or shock in his eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. As I served the courses, I avoided eye contact with everyone, but when I placed a dish in front of Mr. Hawkins, he looked up and asked, "Thank you, miss, have we met before?" His question caught me off guard. I don't think so," I stammered. He tilted his head, clearly trying to place me. "You look familiar." Eleanor quickly intervened. "She's Ethan's wife. She prefers to stay out of the spotlight." Mr. Hawkins said nothing, only nodding politely. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying me. The next morning, while cleaning up, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mr. Hawkins standing outside. "Good morning," he said politely. "May I speak with you?" I hesitated. "Of course, should I get Gerald?" "No," he replied, shaking his head. "I came to see you." He stepped inside, and I led him to the sitting room, my mind racing. What could he possibly want? As he sat down, he examined me carefully. "I couldn't sleep last night," he began. "I feel like I've seen you before." I frowned. "I don't think we've met." "Maybe not directly," he said, pulling out his phone. "But does this look familiar?" He showed me a photo. My heart skipped a beat. It was a picture of my parents, young and smiling at a formal event, with a younger Mr. Hawkins beside them. How do you have this?" I whispered. "I was very close to your parents," he said softly. "Your father and I worked together, and your mother was like a sister to me. When I saw you last night, I couldn't believe my eyes. You're their daughter, aren't you?" Tears welled up as I nodded. "Yes, but they passed away years ago." He leaned back, his face a mix of sorrow and relief. "I had no idea. They spoke of you often. They were so proud of you. I lost touch with them, and I always regretted it." For the first time in ages, I felt truly seen. Mr. Hawkins listened as I shared pieces of my life, and his genuine concern made it easier to open up. He told me that if I ever needed anything, I should not hesitate to ask. "I'm glad I found you," he said as he stood to leave. "Your parents were incredible people. You deserve better than what you've been going through." His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after he had gone. In the days following Mr. Hawkins' visit, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. His words gave me hope, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of connection. Through him, my parents' memory became something bigger, a link I thought was lost. Eleanor noticed the change in me, though I continued with my tasks. My attitude must have shifted. One morning, as I was cleaning the kitchen counters, she approached with her usual superiority. "You've been unusually quiet," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Not that you're one for talking, but you're distant." "I'm just tired," I quickly replied. She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Well, stay focused. We're hosting another dinner next week. Gerald's promotion depends on securing Mr. Hawkins' partnership." The thought of another dinner made my stomach sink. The idea of being paraded around like a servant again was unbearable. But then I remembered Mr. Hawkins' words, "You deserve better than this." A few days before the dinner, I found an envelope addressed to me on the hallway table. It wasn't from Eleanor or Gerald. They never acknowledged my personal life. Inside was a handwritten letter from Mr. Hawkins. "Dear Ava. It was truly a surprise to see you again, but also a blessing. Your parents were dear friends of mine, and I can't bear to see their daughter treated unfairly. I've arranged an opportunity that could change your life. If you're open to it, come to my office this Friday at noon, and I'll explain everything. Warm regards. Daniel H. Innes." My hands shook as I read the letter. Could this really be happening? Was this the lifeline I had been waiting for? Friday arrived, and I was on edge. I told Eleanor I had errands to run and left the house, clutching the letter. At Mr. Hawkins' office, the receptionist led me to his office, where he greeted me with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, gesturing to a seat. He explained that he was connected to a non-profit that supported women in tough situations, and he believed they could help me rebuild my life, where I could regain my self-worth and independence. "But there's more," he continued, leaning forward. "Your parents set up a trust fund for you years ago. I helped them arrange it, but I lost track of it after they passed. It's modest, but enough to give you a fresh start." Tears welled up in my eyes. A chance to start over. It felt too good to be true. That evening, I returned home with a new sense of purpose. Eleanor and Gerald would resist, but I now had something they didn't know about, a plan, a future, and a way out. I quietly began packing, stashing my belongings in the attic, Each day, I collected what I needed. The upcoming dinner was the perfect cover. While they tried to impress Mr. Hawkins, I could slip away unnoticed. As the dinner approached, I found myself smiling more, humming as I worked. Eleanor noticed and misinterpreted it as compliance. "Good," she said with a rare nod of approval. "You're finally understanding your place." If only she knew. The night of the dinner arrived, and I was on edge. Eleanor was barking orders, making sure everything was perfect, while Gerald rehearsed his pitch to Mr. Hawkins. I moved with precision, my heart racing. Tonight was my last night in this house. Guests began arriving, and Mr. Hawkins greeted me with a knowing smile. His presence reminded me of my escape plan. The room buzzed with polite conversation and clinking glasses. As usual, Eleanor had me serving in the kitchen, but Mr. Hawkins wouldn't let me stay in the background. "Ava," he called as I entered with a tray of appetizers, "why don't you join us? We have much to discuss." Eleanor's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "Oh, there's no need for that," she said hastily, laughing nervously. "She's here to help, not to dine." But Mr. Hawkins wasn't having it. "I insist," he said firmly. "Ava is like family to me. I won't have her treated otherwise." The room fell silent. Gerald shifted uncomfortably while Eleanor floundered for a response. Reluctantly, they allowed me to sit. Eleanor glared at me, but I held my composure, strengthened by Mr. Hawkins' support. As dinner continued, the conversation shifted to my parents. Mr. Hawkins shared fond stories, how my father had been his closest friend and how my mother's kindness had touched everyone she met. For the first time in years, it felt like they weren't just memories, they were alive in the room, through someone who had truly known them. Then, Mr. Hawkins dropped the bombshell. "Ava," he said, looking directly at me, "have you told them about the trust fund your parents left for you?" My heart stopped. I looked at Eleanor and Gerald, whose faces shifted from confusion to shock. "Trust fund?" Gerald repeated, disbelief in his voice. "Yes," Mr. Hawkins continued, turning his gaze to them. "Your parents left Ava a substantial sum to ensure she'd never need to rely on anyone else. I'm appalled by how that generosity has been disregarded." Eleanor sputtered, trying to regain control. We weren't aware. She never mentioned it." I met her gaze for the first time that evening, my voice steady. "Because you never asked." The room grew tense. Gerald tried to laugh it off. "Well, this is a misunderstanding. Of course, Ava will have access to her funds, right, Eleanor?" But Eleanor's facade crumbled. "She's ungrateful. After all we've done for her, giving her a roof, food, this is how she repays us." Mr. Hawkins interrupted, calm but resolute. "If by roof and food you mean exploitation and mistreatment, then yes, Eleanor, this is how she repays you, by reclaiming her life." For the first time, I saw Eleanor speechless. Gerald, too, slumped in his chair, his confidence gone. After dinner, I quietly grabbed my packed bag and headed for the door. Mr. Hawkins followed me, offering a ride to the apartment he'd arranged for me through his nonprofit. As I left, I felt a mix of relief, empowerment, and bittersweet closure. Eleanor and Gerald didn't try to stop me, they must have realized their hold on me was broken. The next morning, I woke up in a small but cozy apartment, my apartment. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I attended workshops at the nonprofit, learning the skills to rebuild my life. Mr. Hawkins remained a mentor, helping me manage the trust fund and pursue my dreams. Most importantly, I began rediscovering who I was. I wasn't just a servant or a charity case. I was Ava, a woman with a future. Months later, I sat in a cafe, sipping coffee and reading a book. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility. I often thought of my parents, not with sadness, but with gratitude. They had given me the strength to endure, and now I was living the life they had wanted for me. As for Eleanor and Gerald, I heard through the grapevine that Gerald didn't get his promotion. It seemed karma had a way of balancing things out, but I wasn't focused on them anymore. My life was ahead of me, and I was ready to embrace it. Thanks for watching. See you again in the next video. Stay amazed.